Ewen Cameron, a Scottish psychiatrist with a desire to become a scientific legend. His groundbreaking research in the 1950s hoped to find a cure for serious mental illness, but Dr. Cameron stepped over the line. Secretly funded by the CIA, he brainwashed unsuspecting patients. 5 decades later, some are only now receiving compensation. This is the story of Dr. Ewen Cameron and the patients whose memories he stole. Perched high on a hill above the Canadian city of Montreal is the Allen Memorial Institute. It was inside this building Dr. Ewen Cameron's bizarre story began. Here he created a radical program of psychiatric research. 50 years later, former patients are still struggling to cope with their time in the Allen.
I have nightly nightmares where I wake up screaming. I hear myself screaming. And it was a repeated nightmare where I see a tall man, and then I have this feeling of the cold on my forehead, which I later learned is the jelly applied where the electrodes go, and I feel the electricity going through my body, and people are holding me down, and then I wake up screaming. This is very vivid.
Our research discovered that Ewen Cameron's journey to the top of his profession began in Bridge of Allen. He was born in 1901, the son of a Presbyterian minister. He went to Glasgow University. After graduating in 1924, Cameron moved to North America, where he quickly established himself.
His reputation was very high. He was a pillar of psychiatry in North America. He had a tremendous reputation. He had been president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association. He was he was like a laird.
By the mid-1940s, Cameron's reputation had spread far beyond the shores of North America. At the end of the Second World War, he assessed whether the infamous Nazi doctor Rudolf Hess could stand trial at Nuremberg. Cameron was a man in demand.
These are the days and hours are the occasions. And
the former Glasgow University graduate was to become the first head of the World Psychiatric Association. He was appointed founding director of the Allen Memorial Institute in 1943. It was Cameron's kingdom and became one of the leading psychiatric centers in the world.
He was extraordinarily charismatic. He was a real striver. He was an opinion maker and leader.
Canadian author Anne Collins has written a book on Cameron and his work. She says, in the beginning, he was a man to be admired for his pioneering approach to psychiatric patients. He was enjoying almost godlike status.
The godlike came in his impact in the profession and the way he controlled the funding and the way he could disperse, the way he could set agendas for people. I mean, he was the classic chief in the very sort of hierarchical style of old medicine. He was the guy who said yes and who said no, and the guy who could influence whether your career worked or whether it didn't.
In the late 1950s, Esther Schreier was a young nurse in Montreal. She'd lost a baby and was depressed. Her husband saw a newspaper article on Ewen Cameron's work and was convinced he was the man to help Esther.
I thought he was a brilliant man. I thought he was very concerned for his patient. He thought a lot of himself. He had a big ego. But basically, I found that he was kind and caring for me.
Patients like Esther found Dr. Cameron was a reassuring presence in their troubled lives.
He was pretty good at psychotherapy, talk therapy. And there's some evidence that the force of his character and his approach to people was quite insightful, and that some of the people who went through talk therapy with him at the Allen had very good outcomes.
I remember asking Dr. Ewen Cameron, because mental illness was a disgrace, and I said, I'm really weak. And he said to me, "No, lassie, you're made of tempered steel."
What Ewen Cameron wanted most of all was to be acknowledged and acclaimed for his scientific research. His ambition and enduring vision was to find a cure for psychosis like schizophrenia, and the way he proposed to do it was pretty radical. Even patients like Esther with only mild mental illness were given massive amounts of electroshock therapy. This was combined with a cocktail of powerful drugs, including LSD. It was called depatterning. Cameron believed he could wipe the mind clean of bad thoughts. It meant Esther and others suffered severe memory loss within weeks of the treatment starting.
The first thing I remember was waking up and seeing my husband and asking him, "Who are you?" And he said to me, "I'm your husband." "Husband? Am I married?" "Yes, I'm your husband." And I remember thinking, who am I?
Bevan Weldon was also treated at the Allen. He was depressed after the death of his mother. Ewen Cameron put him on an intensive course of drugs and ECT. It wiped his memory clean.
I was talking with my cousin, I don't know what about, but she said, "Well, don't you remember? Your mother died in your arms." And I said, "What? I have no recollection of that, even to this day. I do not remember my mother dying in my arms."
Step 2 was something called psychic driving. Patients, including Esther and Bevan, were given insulin and put in a coma. Some were asleep for months. During the drug-induced sleep, tape-recorded messages were repeated up to 16 hours a day. The aim was to reprogram the mind so no trace was left of the patient's mental illness. Cameron was convinced he was on the right path, and he made films like this to show his patients were getting better.
To provide an objective record of a subject's behavior, she's filmed before treatment and again after treatment, and the two films placed side by side. Notice how the subject before treatment, in the picture on the right, holds onto the chair as she moves. Notice the difference in posture, the greater effort required to rise from the chair, the longer time needed to complete the simple task.
Esther Schreier was released from the Allen and shortly afterwards successfully gave birth to a baby son, but she'd lost the ability to live a normal life.
I had a new baby, and I didn't know what to do with the baby. And I did have help. I had a nurse, a baby nurse, but she had to have a day off. And she left a book, and I'll just give you a little example. When you hear the baby, this was all in the book, when you hear the baby cry, go to the room, pick up baby, and step by step how to feed the baby, and that was very frightening. And so when I went to see Ewen Cameron, I would explain all my concerns, and he said, "Well, it's from the shock therapy, and it's going to come back." And I would ask him, "How long?" And he said, well, it may take a little time.
Ewen Cameron believed he was curing patients like Esther. To him, Memory loss was a small price to pay.
He thought you had to break eggs to make an omelet, and if you shilly-shallied around, you were a lesser man. You weren't courageous in your profession. So his courage, however, was the wounds were significant that he inflicted on the way to what turned out to be a dead end.
Cameron had spent 20 years practicing these methods on hundreds of patients. In the end, many left the Allen Institute permanently damaged. Some went to asylums, others were left struggling to cope with life in the outside world. Cameron was to leave the Allen in 1964. It was an abrupt and unexpected departure.
When somebody retires after being in the hospital at the university for so long, there's usually a special event to mark his departure. Nothing happened. He crept away, as it were, under a cloud. All his work that he was doing was dismantled, and a sort of a curtain went down on it.
3 years after leaving the Allen Institute, Dr. Ewen Cameron died. Perhaps everyone expected memories of his controversial experiments to fade quietly away. But 10 years after his death, Cameron's work was back in the spotlight. CIA files revealed details of a mind control program codenamed MK-Ultra. Dr. Ewen Cameron was part of it. His research in Montreal had been secretly funded by the intelligence agency. But why? Well, back in the 50s, when Cameron started his work, Cold War paranoia was at its height. The CIA was horrified when American prisoners of war returned from Korea praising communism.
Americans were shocked to find out that many of them had made confessions criticizing their own country or the mission in Korea, and had in some degree spoken in Chinese communist terminology. And of course Americans were confused about how this happened.
In simple terms, the American soldiers had been brainwashed. Psychiatrist and author Dr. Robert J. Lifton interviewed them on their return. He says U.S. intelligence agencies were desperate to learn about brainwashing.
The CIA wanted to embrace it and utilize it as one of its own weapons. And it was thought to be a kind of ultimate weapon, because what greater weapon could there be than control of the human mind?
The CIA thought by controlling the mind, it could create super spies and double agents who would stop the spread of communism.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing. So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
Ewen Cameron's research at the Allen was part of that CIA master plan.
He was among those who was apparently fascinated by what the Chinese communists and in some degree what the Soviets had done. And there's no doubt that he was influenced by currents of so-called brainwashing at that time, even before the CIA began to sponsor his research.
And Dr. Lifton is convinced Cameron and the CIA knew his research techniques were more likely to harm than heal his patients.
What he did in terms of rapid fire and very high electricity, electroshock, not just ordinary electroshock, but particularly intense electroshock, along with the use of the use of coma and drugs and the psychic driving or the constant playing on tape recorders, which he and his assistants were fascinated by, of a patient's conflicts. That combination certainly violated what could be considered therapeutic or even decent medical practice.
So Cameron's patients, many badly damaged by the treatment, had been brainwashed as part of a CIA-funded experiment. Canadians were shocked and angry. A group of 9 former patients took on one of the world's most powerful establishments and won. Compensation from the CIA was settled out of court. But there was still another secret waiting to be revealed. The Canadian government had sanctioned and sponsored the brainwashing experiments on its own citizens.
The Canadian government didn't want to take its share of blame for the disaster that was visited on the lives of a lot of Canadians through the Allen Memorial Institute and Cameron's research, and was very happy when the plaintiffs were suing the CIA, and actually it was only good archival research and the persistence of later patients of Cameron that proved that the Canadian government had funded this particular research just as much as the CIA had done.
The full details of Ewen Cameron's experimental research were now being brought out into the open for the first time. Patients who had been happy and almost honoured to be treated by the eminent Dr. Cameron were of course shocked to learn that their treatment had formed part of a research program funded by the CIA and the Canadian government. But there was worse to come. They discovered in their medical records the exact details of what had been done to them here in the Allen Memorial Institute. For many, it was to prove devastating.
I opened the package and I started to read, and then I just couldn't read anymore. I had to put the package down. I maybe read 6 or 7, 8 pages, and I couldn't read because I was reading about myself, but it wasn't me. Wasn't the person I knew. I was totally different due to all the treatment I had, and I used to have to read maybe 9 or 10 pages a day until I could read the whole lot.
Bevan's records detailed the intensive and complex drug regime he was under. They also revealed just how long the chemical sleep sessions had been. Now I know that as part of the treatment you were put into a drug-induced coma.
Correct.
What was the longest period that you were asleep for?
For me, according to my records, was 21 days. They used to give you an overdose of insulin that put you into a coma. I had well over 500 electroshocks, and I think I'm very lucky because at least I could still work and live a life. Other people just turned them into vegetables. They haven't worked since they came out of it.
Eventually, in the early 90s, the Canadian government paid out $100,000 each to 77 former patients. Gail Kastner wasn't one of them. Despite being one of Dr. Cameron's earliest patients, it was only this summer Gail's lawyer finally won her claim for compensation.
So it's over 10 years before you saw payment of the ex gratia payment. If that isn't a miscarriage of justice, I don't know what is. And to support her...
Gail, or Gertrude as the court referred to her, was just 19 when Ewen Cameron took her on. She's adamant she only had mild depression, which didn't justify intensive electroshock and drug treatment.
As one judge said about my client Gertrude Kastner, her story is a horror story. Because she was in and out of the hospital after these treatments. She became addicted to drugs, and she had a very difficult time of getting off the drug scene. And she eventually did it on her own, but she was in and out of hospitals throughout a good part of her life. It's a very, very sad story.
During her stay at the Allen Memorial Institute, Gail was allowed out for family visits. She recalls a statement for the court case in which her sister gives a disturbing account of the effect the treatment had on her.
I'm reduced to a childish state, that I'm talking baby talk, that I'm thumb sucking, that I'm incontinent. And apparently when she took me home these weekends, I would make demands to be taken to the park. In other words, I was reduced to an infant.
50 years has gone by, but Gail still has problems dealing with everyday life. Many of her memories are gone forever. Medical examinations have revealed permanent damage.
I'm brain damaged, organically brain damaged, that he destroyed certain cells that will never regenerate. And when I came out, I'm sorry, I forgot the question. This is very difficult for me.
At the time, none of the patients treated by Ewen Cameron were told exact details of the techniques he planned to use. They certainly never consented to be part of a brainwashing experiment.
For me, the most damaging part was that they were unaware that they were used as guinea pigs. They had no idea that they were being treated by Dr. Cameron on an experimental basis. They were under the impression that they were being treated for therapeutic purposes and not on an experimental basis.
Esther Schreier has spent the last 45 years trying to rebuild her life. She wishes Dr. Cameron had been honest with her.
If I was asked, do you want to be as an experiment or do this, I would feel better. Or even after, when I was going through such hell, if it would have been explained to me, every month I would go back and I would discuss, I can't remember, I don't know how to do things, and it'll come back. I mean, if he had only told me the reason, I'd have even been able to fight it better. And so I feel now I can say he's not a monster, but I wonder what I thought when I was going through such hell. What I really thought, I knew I was very, very angry, and it was very, very difficult. I can't stress enough how hard it was to come back.
Esther's feelings are shared by many of Cameron's former patients. If they'd been told much earlier what had been done and why, it would have helped with their recovery. It might even have stopped families from splitting up under the pressure. Esther and her husband Haskell just had to rely on love and commitment.
I was just patient and helped her and sort of looked, is this the way it's going to be? Then I have to do my right thing and take care of her and help her along and do everything that she needs and requires.
I was trying to fit into society. I was trying to bring up a child. I wanted to be a good wife for my husband, who was so wonderful, and it was hard. That's what I want people to know. It was hard, and I'm very lucky I had, again, the stamina to overcome.
Dr. Ewen Cameron had come a long way from Bridge of Allan in Scotland. He became one of the world's most acclaimed psychiatrists. He was a powerful and hugely influential figure. But ultimately, did he fail to achieve his greatest ambition? What Cameron wanted more than anything was to be the psychiatrist who successfully pioneered a brand new treatment for severe mental illness. He thought brainwashing, which was funded by the CIA, was the way to do it. He was wrong.
He stood up in February 1963 at a meeting of the American Psychopathological Association in New York City and basically said, I took a really wrong turn, and explained to everybody that everything he had done was ineffectual. And in a way, it was his mea culpa. And it was not only his mea culpa, but it was also, he wasn't ever really guilty about having taken the wrong path, in the sense that he thought that was how science worked. You took you took a path, you explored it to the ends, and you accepted the consequences of that, and on you went. But what he wanted to do was set the record straight so nobody else would take that wrong turn that he had taken.
So an admission of failure from the man himself. But what do his former patients think?
I don't believe that he intentionally did this. He saw perhaps things that we didn't. I think that he got lost somewhere along the way, figuring that this would be good for his patients, and either got seduced by it all, and it didn't turn out perhaps the way he thought it would. Who really knows? The only one that could have really told us is Dr. Ewen Cameron.
If I had been like some of his patients, I don't think I could, even think about forgiveness or anything like that. It's just that, as I say, I consider I'm very lucky for some reason and managed to live a reasonable life afterwards where the others couldn't. He took it from them. He took their memory from them, and life is memory when you think about it.
Robert J. Lifton, a widely respected psychiatrist and a world-renowned expert on brainwashing, says Cameron's ultimate crime was betraying his patients' trust.
Cameron was a man of great standing and a powerful figure to whom people could transfer their emotions and really admire or even worship without any belief that he would harm them. In that sense, he was doubly culpable for harming people who believed in him and for not looking critically at his own behavior.
And despite finally getting compensation, Gail still cannot forgive the man she feels stole her past and ruined her future.
I think he's a monster. I don't think he had one single redeeming quality or one shred of human decency. And he used and abused his power horribly. And I hope he met a very bad ending and suffered as he made his other victims suffer knowingly.
As with all human endeavors, it's hard to put it into a bunch of cliches and say he was a god or he was a devil. You can say he was a deeply flawed man, driven by good intentions and by heavy ambition. He wanted to be a bigger man than his father. He wanted to go to his grave knowing he'd made a difference. And I think that probably the worst sort of purgatory for Ewen Cameron is to understand that after death he became infamous rather than revered for his impact on his science.